Hey everyone, Mystery here, and today I'd like to talk about Zealot. If you'll permit me a few minutes, looks at progress bar, I just want to talk about where Zealot is at currently. This is sort of a checkup of a sorts. How is our boy doing? How is my boy doing? As you may or may not know, Zealot is what I'd consider to be my main in Darktide. It's the class I played the most, it's the class I played first, and it holds a special significance to me for that. And the reason I'm making this video now is because the Zealot has seen a big overhaul recently, you may or may not be aware. And this overhaul, I think, is going to be the way the Zealot will remain for some time. In the cases of the Psyker and the Veteran, which I will probably also make a video on in the coming days to weeks, they have been promised to be in an intermediate state. They are not yet at that finalized form where Fat Shark wants them. This is like a stopgap solution to give them some more diversity in their playstyles before they receive more thorough overhauls. Although the Zealot, they're kind of ambiguous on whether or not there's going to be more changes to the Zealot going forward, but I think given the nature and the sheer number of changes that his talent tree has seen, that the way his abilities have work and the way his like cooldowns and stuff work, have seen, it makes me think that there's less likelihood that he'll be receiving any really comprehensive changes in the future. And so I think it's a safe bet to just go ahead and evaluate him as is right now. And this is going to be a thorough evaluation, okay? We're doing the full physical here. We're going to fondle the balls. I want to get in there. I want to talk about the weapons, the weapon choices. I want to talk about the new talent tree. I want to talk about blitzes, auras, abilities, keystones, all that stuff, and where his strengths and weaknesses lie, and then sort of where he fits into the overall cast of characters as we currently stand in, and how I'm feeling about the class, most importantly. And let me know in the comments too if I like missed out on anything that you've been feeling about this. Maybe you're a Zealot main and you know, there's something about this rework that really you like or you really don't like and you just want to voice the frustration. That'd be a great place to do it. And if you admire this sort of video and you just like chilling and hanging out, yeah, consider subscribing and helping support the channel. Thank you. Let's start by talking about the talent tree overhaul in a very general sense. I'll come back and circle around to talking about abilities and keystones and the balance thereof in a little bit, but for right now, I just want to touch on whether or not this talent tree overhaul was a good thing for the class. And I think that unequivocally the answer is yes, right? The Zealot was pretty much a one-note sort of character previously. If you were above a certain skill level or had a certain level of exposure to content around the game, you had all seen the one Zealot build, and that was just because all the strong talents in the tree were grouped together. There were very linear paths to follow, and there weren't really a whole lot of different options for setting yourself up with any sort of reasonable power outside of that. You were wasting a ton of points to go towards anything else or stray from the main path, as we'll say. With this new tree, you can invest in tons and tons of different power level talents. You can mix and match between different trees with very little opportunity cost, and there's also all sorts of really interesting decisions to make that will not only mean that you have to sort of get a trade-off between like, oh, here's a really powerful talent and here's one that's not so great that's right next to it, but they'll also sort of color you in terms of, oh, well, this talent and this talent together will make for a very interesting build. So for instance, we have this talent over on the right side, and by the way, my favorite part of the whole talent tree is this middle section right here. I think there's a lot of very interesting decisions to be made here, although some of these talents aren't exactly the greatest. But we've got Unseen Blade here, 15% damage versus enemies not targeting you. Now, this is very specifically enemies not targeting you. Enemies that you have dodged or you've gotten behind are still targeting you. They'll turn around and hit you. So this has to be an enemy that is completely distracted by someone else or is taunted, or you have dropped all of your aggro. And that means this is a great fit for stealth builds. Now, right above this is Thy Wrath Be Swift. And Thy Wrath Be Swift is a really good staple note for two-hander builds because it prevents you from getting staggered when you're swinging your two-hander, and it can make you move faster when you do get hit. So on paper, these two really don't work together so well, because this one down here means that enemies are not going to be targeting you, so therefore you're not really getting hit. But this one up here is to prevent yourself from taking damage when you do get hit. But what it could tell a player is, okay, well, let's see. This is for two-handed weapons, and this is for stealth builds. What if I did a stealth two-handed weapon build? And in fact, that's a very viable possibility in the current setup. So that's a great way of sort of like putting two nodes together that don't really seem that they have a whole lot in common, but you can marry them together with certain build setups in the tree. And in this middle tree here, you've got support elements that work really well, or you can go into like more damage side, like you can just go for damage, or you can go more utility over here. You have a free choice of auras, more or less. You have a free choice of blitzes, and obviously the abilities have been rebalanced and retweaked, which I'll come back to in a little bit. But yeah, the overall changes and the way that you will have enough points because of the reduction in those minor nodes that were like 1/3 of the tree before, the way that you'll have so many points to spend and get some varying power level talents across the tree really means you have a lot of very meaningful decisions to make. You can take as many of the toughness regenerating nodes as you want. They're all up here in a line at the top of the tree, or you can only pick one and rely on your own skills to avoid damage, and then invest tons and tons of points in just straight damage nodes farther down in the tree. So I think this is just a really, really great rework. I mean, you guys can let me know in the comments if you agree. I think it's a great rework in the sense that it has brought a lot of much needed diversity to the way that you can build the Zealot. Now, does that mean that every build is going to be as powerful as every other build? No. And I think a lot of that is differentiated by weapon choices and a few talents being and paths being a little bit underpowered or overpowered. But it's within a realm of reason, right? As opposed to where it was before, where there was a very, very clear set of nodes that was taken in almost every single build. So we've done well on that front. Let's talk about weapon choices though. And this is something I have two main points I want to make here about the Zealot. The first main point that we need to address is, has the Zealot's overall weapon diversity been increased? Notably, he didn't get any new weapons, right? But perhaps some changes to his talent tree and the way he is allowed to pick talents now, and the game itself have enabled or disabled certain weapons from being useful. And I think both of these play a factor here. So previously on Zealot, the weapons that were really considered usable in medium to high level of play, the ones you'd see people actually using in game, were the combat blade, the tactical axe, sometimes the crusher. We would also see occasionally the relic blade. The relic blade was actually fairly common because it's a powerful weapon. I think people realize that. And then of course the dueling sword. The weapons you really didn't see were things like the shock maul, the thunder hammer, the chain weapons were all like completely like 1% players playing with them. Combat axe, devil's claw, heavy sword, right? These weapons are just lacking in power, or were lacking in power. They were behind their adversaries in terms of DPS, in terms of usability. So obviously players are going to find the things that work. And when you're playing a class that's as melee focused as the Zealot is, which is the second point I want to get to, then it really becomes incumbent on you to choose an effective melee option, right? A class like the Veteran that can get away with having a sort of niche melee option that might not do everything very well, but it does one type of enemy really well, can make up for that because he has ranged options at his avail that he can make powerful and counter those other enemy types, right? So you could use a recon las gun and be able to burn down bosses and light targets, and then all your melee needs to do is be able to kill crushers on the targets the recon can't. So this for the Zealot is a problem, because the Zealot has increased his diversity with this patch. He has gotten more weapons that I would say are in that A tier that are very usable now because of the buffs to his tree, because of the buffs to utilizing two-handed weapons, and the shift away from every single build needing to be a crit build to be like, you know, the utmost efficient. We are seeing a lot more assault chain sword, heavy visitor, all the chain weapons, chain axe are all really good. Shock maul can even be used because, yeah, shock maul scales really well with our added damage now. But at the same time, and of course, like a dueling sword and relic blade and combat blade, those weapons that were already at the top of the power scale are still up there. But some weapons really lost out in a big way because of the changes to crushers. And I've made a video about this before, Two Swords, where I talked about how there were weapons that were already on the cusp of not being usable because there are these carapace armored enemies in the game that you just dink off of and you can't effectively deal with, and now those enemies have twice as much HP. And if you're playing into Havoc, you were just getting inundated with them over and over and over again. And those weapons that struggled before were like the Tack Axe, the Devil's Claw, the Heavy Sword, the Combat Axe, the Crusher. Those weapons lost big in this patch because although there's more power added to the Zealot as a class, these weapons already struggled with these Crusher enemies, and now these Crushers are even more of a hurdle, to the point where it's completely futile to attempt to kill more than like one of them if you're not using one of the weapons that can actually counter them. So overall, melee weapons and diversity of melee weapons on this class went up, but there were some weapons that have been pushed even farther down, and there were some that were pretty high up before that I would rank a lot lower now as a result of these changes. Now, this brings me to my second point, which is that I fear that the Zealot is too one-note to have such little diversity in his melee weapons. And what I mean by that is, if you look across all of the classes, right, you have within Psyker and Veteran, who are ranged archetypes, basically, they have melee options. You can play a melee Psyker very effectively. You can play a melee Veteran very effectively. You can play a hybrid of both of those. For Ogryn, who is primarily a melee type, and for Arbites, who is primarily a melee type, you can play a ranged archetype and get a lot of value. For instance, you can go Bolter Arbites and demolish bosses, demolish hordes. You can go Shotgun Arbites and pump like serious damage out there. You can go Rumbler Ogryn, you can go Kickback Ogryn, you can go Heavy Stubber Ogryn. Even though like the Ogryn's specific archetype of point blank barrage isn't that strong in the ranged category, he does have ranged options, and so does the Arbites. They have these ranged options that very much play into their overall power, right? For the Zealot, however, the Zealot is the only class in the game that currently is almost entirely devoted to melee. I got a comment on my recent Zealot video, but said like, you know, you picked the Flamer and you used it only like, you know, you used your melee weapon 99% of the time. Well, that's because there really isn't much reason to use your range weapon on the Zealot, excepting if you are going Bolter or Flamer, the two weapons that can do something that you really can't, or can do it a lot faster and more efficiently than your melee weapon. But for the Zealot, many of his ranged options, as we'll scroll through them here, many of his ranged options are just not important enough to ever consider pulling out unless you're eliminating a Trapper or a Special or something like that. Your answer to most situations is charge at it and hit it with your melee weapon. You do not have almost any talents in the entire tree. There are no abilities, there are no keystones that are range focused, so these weapons don't get any additional buffs from the class, and therefore your choice of range weapon becomes almost an afterthought. It's just like a little bit of flavor. Use some, and how many times have I said this, right? The build is not incumbent around the range weapon for this class. Use whatever range weapon you are comfortable with that you can eliminate X and Y target with, and that's the solution. That is all that is required to choose a range weapon on the Zealot, and it's because 95+% of his power is invested in the melee side of things. And this makes his choices between what range weapon to choose very ineffectual. It almost doesn't matter, excepting if you want to take something into the very high levels of gameplay, your choices are extremely slim. You have to choose something that can snipe specials. So like if you're looking to snipe specials, you need like the revolver or the las pistol or something like that, or you need to choose something that can effectively do a fuck ton of damage in a short amount of time, which is the Bolter or the Purgation Flamer, right? But like you're not going to be bringing Braced Autogun, Vigilant Autogun, Infantry Autogun, Recon Lasgun. Like these weapons just don't get any additional boost. On the Veteran, you can play a very strong melee Veteran and then have a range weapon that also gets significant boosts out of your talent tree and can put in a lot of work, right? So your choice of both weapons actually affects your overall power. So when I say, okay, yeah, we're going for a melee veteran, like I put out like a week or so ago, or close to a week ago, when I put that build out, it was actually important that your range weapon was the quick draw stub revolver, because that enabled us to pump in a bunch of extra damage utilizing some of these talents that have synergies together. And this does not exist on the Zealot. The Zealot is completely invested in that melee power and accepting like I think 2 talents that can give you range power at all. And this is what I would say if Fat Shark is watching this, or if Fat Shark is interested in taking this Zealot and making him more diverse, because obviously he lacks diversity because he doesn't get to choose. Really, both weapons aren't really a choice. It's like really just your melee weapon's the one that has most of the impact on the build. Give the Zealot the option to choose 2 melee weapons. This would distinguish him from the other classes in such a tremendous way, and it would really give a reason to play the Zealot these days, because, and this is the thing, I guess I'll spoil my overall take on the Zealot. I feel like the Zealot is a very fun class to play, but I don't really see a whole lot of reason currently to play the Zealot over playing Ogren or over playing Arbites. If you're just going for straight up melee damage, I feel like those guys can do effectively as much damage in most cases, unless you're like assassinating bosses or something. And yeah, and they are they're stronger classes overall, I feel, with taunt and bully clubs and whatever the fuck Arbites has going on. So if the Zealot could use 2 different melee weapons and have one for like thunder hammering bosses and one for fencing off, dueling like with a little horde and stuff like that, that would be amazing, and it would lead to so many unique choices for this class alone that can bring weapons, 2 melee weapons for different situations. And I think that would be an amazing way to really distinguish his playstyle and also justify the fact that 95+% of his talent tree is only melee focused. Anyway, that's all I want to talk about weapons. Let's go on and talk about the Zealot's abilities. Now, I have quite a bit to say on this front, and remember that this discussion or the video is about whether or not the rework has improved the Zealot and improved on the issues that he was having before, which means that I need to not only identify to you what issues the Zealot's abilities had before, but determine whether or not it's actually been made better with the rework. And I might have a little bit of a controversial opinion here. If you disagree, let me know down in the comments. I might be insane, I might be completely off my rocker, but I'm gonna give you my conclusion, or sort of my hypothesis, and then I'm gonna fill in the supporting evidence and sort of explain to you why I have come to this feeling about Zealot, the class that I probably know the best out of all the classes. So my conclusion, and remember that we're talking about whether this has improved on where we were before. Before the update, the Zealot suffered from limited choices, a very, very distinct lack of choice between abilities. There's not enough differentiation, and there's limited options for players in terms of ability choice for the Zealot. And that seems crazy, because like all these abilities are pretty damn good, right? Now, after the update, I think it's very much the same. I think that the Zealot's ability choices are still extremely limited, and I'm going to explain why. So starting with, one of these abilities is just not going to be part of this discussion really at all, and that is Shroud Field. Shroud Field is the black sheep of the abilities. Shroud Field is a stealth ability, right? And a stealth ability in Darktide, there's only 2 of them. There's Shroud Field and there's Infiltrate for the veteran. Now, granted, Shroud Field is a much better executed ability and much more thematic on the Zealot than it is on the veteran, but it is still an ability that fundamentally takes you out of the core gameplay loop of Darktide. It is downright antithetical to the reason that many of us play Darktide, and for that reason, it is seen as just not a desirable way to play the game for a vast majority of players. Even with Darktide, or even with Shroudfield being as powerful as it is, which it is a very, very powerful ability, you really don't see very many players running this ability, right? Even though it is ostensibly as powerful or more powerful than Fury of the Faithful, which is the charge ability, it is very, very seldom played. It really only has purpose as a assassination tool for bosses, right? And that has limited usability in terms of the overall game. The reason why this is, I think, in my hypothesis, is that it is just, again, an ability that not many people really vibe with. Many players play this game, they want to stand with their allies shoulder to shoulder, fight the hordes,
be part of the combat. And Shroudfield essentially says, no, I'm not part of that. I am going to disengage. I'm going to be invisible. Nothing pays attention to me. I don't play the game really. Like, you're not dodging, blocking, parrying, whatever it is. You are just pressing the button, walking around behind stuff, pressing the other button, and then you wait a little bit and you do it all again, rinse and repeat. So it kind of like takes away the game part of the game, and you end up playing a game that really doesn't feel like Darktide at all. So Shroudfield, even when it is powerful, like I was saying before, is very, very underpicked for this reason. Now, so since that one is sort of out of the discussion, and I think that probably, the evidence is out there, right, guys? Let me know in the comments if I'm crazy, but I never fucking see Shroudfield Zealots. And I think also the community sentiment around it is that it's a very toxic ability, and no one really wants to run with them on their team. So that kind of enforces that as well. But so now the decision comes down to two abilities, right? The Chorus ability and the Fury of the Faithful, aka the Charge ability. I'll just call it Charge from here on out. So previously, in High Havoc, in the highest level content in the game, the assumption was Chorus was the way to go. 90% plus of Zealots that you would encounter are running Chorus. In fact, it was kind of seen as impolite to not run Chorus on Zealot because it was that good of an ability. And it was good for several reasons, right? First of all, High Havoc and high difficulties in this game are very hectic places, and sometimes you need to press the pause button and get a full reset for your team and clear the space, and this is the top ability in the game at doing this. The only downside it has is cooldown, and previous to this update, the cooldown was not really a problem, because there was tons of things like Invocation of Death and Pious Cutthroat that could just reset your cooldown in a matter of seconds. You'd have this thing up about every 15 seconds, and for a ability that is as powerful as it is, that was quite a short cooldown. So people were spamming this left and right, and Chorus Bot, through, through probably some fault of mine, became a very, very consistent and strong part of the Havoc high-level gameplay meta. However, once you lower your difficulty down past like Auric, perhaps even like once you leave Havoc in general, you do not see Chorus played. Why? Because what use is there for an ability that solely is preventing against huge onslaughts of massive hordes that would run you over in 5 seconds, right? That is not occurring on difficulties that aren't in the Havoc range. And so for the vast majority of players, this ability is not only useless, but it is boring. This is one of the most poorly designed abilities in the game in terms of a gameplay standpoint. You don't play when it's going on. In fact, not only do you not play, but the enemies don't play. So everybody just stands around. You stand around staring at the enemies and they're bored. The enemies just stand around staring at you and they're bored. If they had minds, they would be bored. And your allies are probably bored too, because they just walk around and stab all enemies to death that are just standing still waiting for the disco to end. So this ability just like completely brings the gameplay to a halt in a similar way to Smite, but at least with Smite, like the person who's smiting is having a good time, right? And there's like counterplay to this. This is just an ability that makes you and your allies invincible and then shoves everything around for like 7 seconds. So when this ability got nerfed, and to be clear, this ability itself didn't get nerfed, but the cooldown got nerfed, and that enough has been enough to take it off of the throne. Players were like, oh shit, go ahead and threaten me with a good time. Like, it's like a godsend to be able to actually play the Zealot into a high-level game and not have players be like, oh, play Chorus, right? Because Chorus was so good and so dominant before, it would be seen as an affront to not bring Chorus. But now you are permitted to bring non-Chorus stuff because the Chorus just isn't up as often as it was before, and that has brought it down a lot in terms of power, right? It is no longer the be-all, end-all of like a Havoc core composition. In fact, I don't even know if the Zealot's on the composition anymore, which brings me to the final part of this, which is, okay, so now that you are not playing Chorus in your games, right? Either you are playing in Havoc, and it's been nerfed now to the point where it's like the trade-offs of, okay, I don't get to do any damage, because remember, you have 7 seconds every 40 seconds or whatever it is that you're just standing around doing nothing. Meanwhile, you're probably using that at a time where there's a lot of fighting going on, right? Or there would be, because you use it during really hectic times, so your team is getting to like blast and do a ton of damage and have a ton of fun, and you're just standing around pausing everything for them. And that puts you not only behind in terms of damage because you spend 7 seconds doing nothing, but you're also trading out a ability that could potentially be increasing your damage or your usefulness as a DPS instead. So you get to be a support, but you're like the worst support, right? Because you just don't get to do anything while you're doing this ability, and it's not up all that often. So yeah, this ability really took a big hard L, and that means that many players are not going to want to play it anymore because it's just not as competitive. And that means those remaining players are going to play Fury of the Faithful, right? They're going to play Fury of the Faithful, right? Like that's because they're probably not going to play Shroudfield, because Shroudfield, many players are just never going to play that. So they'll go play the Fury of the Faithful because that's the DPS. That's the last thing. That's the last ability. Oh wait, there's other classes in the game that can play melee. Oh, and they do the job like similar or better. Okay, so why am I playing Zealot then? And that is ultimately the problem for Zealot, right? Is that yes, does he have some pretty considerable damage when you're using Fury of the Faithful? Sure. Does he have ability to kill bosses pretty damn fast with Shroudfield? Absolutely. Could another class that has more going on and can contribute more to the team than just straight damage do very similar or better damage numbers and still get to play melee? Yes, because the Arbites and the Ogryn exist. And the Ogryn even has a charge ability. Oh, both of those classes have charge abilities, right? So if you wanted to play a charge and get in the enemy's face and beat them up with weapons, those classes have got you covered. And those classes have crowd control abilities like shock mines and taunt, and they have ranged weapons that can bring a lot of value. They have a dog right between, well, one of them has a dog. Like, these classes have a lot that can contribute. The Zealot, when you're speccing into Fury of the Faithful, is a guy who runs really fast and does a lot of melee damage. But the other guys do a lot of melee damage too, and they also happen to provide a ton of other utility and, more importantly, crowd control. They are stagger and CC masters as compared to the Zealot. It's not enough anymore, is what I'm saying, to just have a guy who attacks really fast and does a lot of crits. Like, that's supposed to be his, like, design pretty clearly, is he's a guy who attacks fast, crits lots, but his damage numbers, the damage numbers that the Zealot is putting out, isn't enough to justify bringing the Zealot. Like, I don't think there's really any argument to be made that, like, the Zealot is the fourth member you bring in the team because his damage is just that good, right? You need players, or you need classes that can do both, that can play and be full DPS, but also they have these certain talents or these certain abilities that can bring tons of utility to the team. So you can play an Ogryn with the Bully Club, but also you have Taunt, and Taunt stops everything in the map from moving, and then it makes it come to you, so that buys your team a ton of time. You can play, as I dump my fucking Celsius on me, thankfully there's only a drip in there, you can play Arbites and charge and slam into enemies and start to beat them up, but also that knocks down all the enemies you hit and buys your team a ton of time, makes a ton of space. You also have the dogs running around and CCing enemies. You can send them off the distant targets and all sorts of like crazy stuff, utility, shock mines, whatever it might be. Like those things, those additional things that are happening outside of just being a straight DPS powerhouse are what threatens the Zealot's existence. So what makes me question, why would I really want to play the Zealot over anything else? Because I can't really say, in all earnesty, that the Zealot experience moment to moment is all that different than just playing as the Arbites, except for I get to use the dueling sword on the Zealot. But I could also just play the Veteran and have pretty similar melee damage-ish, and then I also could use the plasma gun, right? or like recon las gun and have infinite ammo. So like these other classes, as the Zealot loses some of his identity as an aura bot, you suddenly realize that the reason, one of the primary reasons that aura or chorus was so dominant, like this had a 90% plus pick rate in terms of Zealots and Havoc. The reason it was so absurdly dominant wasn't because it was just like that good of an ability. It's because these are Zealot players and they don't really play other classes, and it's just like not competitive in terms of DPS when we're going to the other classes, right? So if you want to play DPS these days, the Zealot is pretty far down on that list, right? He doesn't have massive AoE like Ogryn and like Psyker do. He doesn't have the ability to command really powerful ranged attacks like the Veteran does. He doesn't have he doesn't have an ability that can buff the entire team or provide utility to the entire team like Bubble or Shout or Taunt. and the ability to maintain full DPS at the same time. So he trades off his, like, he gets a large portion of his damage from using Fury of the Faithful, but that is an entirely selfish ability. And so this is where it leaves the Zealot right now, is, yeah, he is a solo, like, assassin type class that, like, yes, he can do some good damage, but so can everybody else at the current juncture. And yeah, I think that is the problem with his abilities as it currently stands. If I didn't spell it out, I'll go back and recap it on it one more time. Chorus used to dominate Havoc because it was the only thing that really made it worthwhile to bring a Zealot into Havoc instead of any other class. Fury of the Faithful is still a good ability, but other classes can do this sort of damage with no problem and bring more utility to the team at the same time. And Shroudfield is just an ability that is not going to be appealing to the vast majority of players because it's toxic. It encourages like isolated gameplay and not staying with the team, and oftentimes like it just is not contributing, again, in the same way that Fury of the Faithful doesn't really contribute other than just being maximal DPS. Yeah, like this is just a pure DPSer's ability, and at the end of the day, like you need to be offering team utility and synergies plus that stuff in order to be considered a really good and powerful class right now. So that's how I'm feeling about abilities. Let's finally wrap up by talking about the blitzes and keystones. So blitzes, I mean, great change here, right? Blades of Faith, Immolation Grenade, Sunstorm Grenade, these are all really good nades to have. I like that the choice has been made free because all of these have their use cases, and a clever player, a skilled player can use them at the appropriate time and get a big effect, right? So Sunstorm Grenade is here to save anything out of any situation, just only doesn't stun bosses, and everything else you're good to go. Immolation Grenade, if you can group up stuff, this will do absolutely like millions of damage, like no joke. You can do like 100,000 plus damage with a single grenade if you can get enough enemies to like, follow you into it. And then of course the classic knives, which are just still such an efficient tool because you aren't going to be taking from that team-wide grenade economy. I think that the Zealot has a good argument to be made that he is one of the best grenade users currently, because if you think about the other grenade users, you have Veteran, who prints his own grenades and therefore really doesn't need to take very many of them. You have the Psyker, who doesn't take grenades. You have the Ogryn, who has the big box of grenades, which is a pretty impactful grenade. So that's probably in competition. And you have the Arbites, who really has one impactful grenade, which is the Shock Mine. And if you're running Shock Mine, there's a high percentage chance you're running Douglas, and therefore you're regenerating your own grenades. So like, you probably don't need to pick up packs if you're running Shock Mines. So those grenades can, in some large way, go to the Zealot. Now the question becomes like, is one of the, or like two of these or three of these as good as 3 cluster bombs for the Ogryn? I don't know, right? Or resetting and getting 3 more shock mines on your Arbites in an instant. I don't know. Since that is a shared resource, it's hard to say, but it's nice to have that option. Like, I'll say that this is definitely an improvement over the previous tree, where like you wanted to use these 2 grenades on some builds and you just couldn't. So yeah, definitely a big win here, and that's all the more I'll say about it. All these grenades are very powerful. And then finally, let's talk about our keystones. We have a big power change in terms of Martyrdom, first and foremost. Martyrdom is doing a lot better than it was previously. Martyrdom has always been on the cusp of being usable, but it just needed that stat bonus, right? It's a high risk, high reward, and the rewards never were enough to justify the risk. And the other thing that is really helping Martyrdom is the nerfing of certain cooldown abilities and the creation of this cooldown ability called Martyr's Purpose, which gives you cooldown regeneration when you're missing health. Previously, the best cooldown abilities were Invocation of Death, which required you to crit at least once every 4 seconds, and then it would give you like an extra triple cooldown for that amount of time. And then you also had like Pious Cutthroat, which is like getting backsteps. But those weren't in the line with Martyrdom, and Martyrdom doesn't have any basic crit building facilities, so you would be hard pressed. You'd have to sacrifice something on your weapon in order to get crits, right? And that was a struggle for Martyrdom, because Martyrdom kind of worked really well with certain two-handed weapons that aren't crit powerhouses like the Relic Blade. So yeah, you'd want to use like Relic Blade, and Relic Blade doesn't have a great baseline crit as it is, and therefore you're missing out on one of the most powerful ways to exists as a Zealot, which is just generating infinite cooldown through Invocation of Death. Thankfully, they have added a low health ability cooldown talent here that makes it like almost as good just to run on low HP as in terms of getting your cooldown up, and it's very dependable. So Martyrdom has gotten a big boost in terms of sort of fixing up that cooldown lacking issue that it had before, and obviously also they've just stacked a bunch of extra stats in this thing. 50% melee damage, almost 40% toughness damage reduction, and 30% attack speed when fully stacked, and it requires 1 less wound carrier to do. So this is just a huge win for Martyrdom all around. I think it's probably the strongest keystone out here, just like as the keystone itself, but we have to now look at Blazing Piety, which is also very tremendously good because crits are so good in this class, and getting 25% extra crit and also potentially giving your team 10% crit chance, which is double the Psyker's aura, is very massive. Like, crits are a big enabler for a lot of things on a lot of classes, right? A crit on any class that's wielding like a dagger is like, is guaranteed bleeds. If you are or if you're attacking a carapace enemy, you immediately get a certain factor of rending when you get a crit. For flame staff psychers, that's 2 stacks of flame every time you get a crit, right? So it's a very important thing to be able to grant to your team if you're playing from a support angle. And so the ability to choose all of this as well with less talent points committed is fantastic, and it works really well with a ton of talents on the Zealot, who is really built around those high crit weapons. Although, the changes to Martyrdom, like I said, those also benefit the non-crit weapons. And then finally, we need to talk about the Run to the Litter, which is Inexorable Judgment. This ability is fine, whereas these other 2 keystones are S tier. This one is, I would say, B tier, right? Inexorable Judgment is just not enough stats. It doesn't present enough to differentiate itself from the rest of the cast here. You get damage and attack speed, and this applies to ranged as well, which is something the other talents can't really do. I mean, you get crit chance, which can apply to range out of Blazing Piety, but this one gives you just straight ranged damage. So if you're going for some sort of ranged archetype, which really isn't encouraged in the Zealot build, Inexorable Judgment will be your choice, and it does play better with weapon swapping as a result. But I just think this keystone is so lame, and I don't really feel that, although it did grow in power, by getting more stacks and being more usable, I don't really feel like it grew as much as the rest of the keystones did and as the rest of Zealot did in this patch. So yeah, I still have to feel like Inexorable Judgment is probably the most inadvisable keystone to take for any given build. I feel like you could just get better results on one of the other options for every weapon that I can think of anyway. So that's my overall take on where those talents in the tree are at, and let's wrap up with some final thoughts. So, in summary, some closing thoughts on the Zealot. I will try to put together a overall thesis on this class and where it's at right now, and I don't know if it was clear over the course of however long this video was. I'll see it in the timeline, but thank you for listening to the yap with me. I'm not feeling terribly optimistic about the Zealot in the current state of things, guys. I just don't fundamentally understand what his purpose is. If they're going to take away his chorus botting ability, yes, he can bring some powerful melee DPS to the front, but so can pretty much everybody else at this point. And I think this falls down to 2 main categories. First of all, he's got a limited weapon selection as compared to every other class in terms of diversifying his playstyles, right? You can go any number of melee weapons on the veteran and then further identify and characterize that build by your choice of ranged weapon, and that adds a lot of diversity and a lot of different playstyles and variety to the veteran and the power that he can bring to each mission. Same thing applies to the Psyker, right? There's options for, do I want to use my ranged weapon at all? Do I want to use my melee weapon at all? Do I want to have a hybrid? And if I do hybrid, which range and which melee do I want to bring? And the same thing applies to all the other classes, right? The Zealot alone is the class that has 95+% of his power invested in solely melee. So it is incumbent on him to utilize these melee weapons better than anybody else can. But I can't look at you with a straight face and say with any certainty that the Zealot is a better user of, say, the dueling sword than the veteran is of the current state, right? Because the veteran can do everything the Zealot can do, plus or minus a couple percent, and he can also pull out the fucking plasma gun and go to town with that. So like, yeah, he's got people that are, if not equal to him, close enough that the other utilities and the other things they bring to games do end up like tend to outweigh him. So he needs, and he has like the Eviscerator, like that's a good weapon, right? The Thunderhammer isn't good enough for what it needs to be, in my personal opinion. But what he needs really is something more than just like additional damage, right? He needs a Relic. I guess Relic Blade is pretty good too, but like I would really love to see a change to the way his other two abilities work. I know that they probably will never change Shroud Field, but I feel like Chorus could still be on the table to be changed. And now I guess we'll convert to talking about the second point I have here, which is I think that the abilities that he has been designed with are just kind of screwing him over. They're really, really limiting his potential because there is a very small number of players who either are playing at the difficulties where Chorus is relevant or want to play with Shroud Field or Chorus at all. And the default playstyle of charging is very fun and all, but it is very limited. So I would very much encourage Fat Shark, and I'd very much like to see something change in a way that he can be more useful with his melee focus, right? Like he can charge, but like that's about it right now, right? Like Chorus doesn't contribute anything to your meleeing and the way you play. So almost every build plays like pretty much exactly the same. And that is also really limiting the amount of power he can bring to bear through his abilities as well. Because yes, he can charge in and assassinate dudes, but so can the Arbites, so can the Ogryn. And like, you know, Psyker and Veteran can just kill stuff from range, or they can run in themselves and shout stuff down or be super fast as Squire's Gaze. Like the Zealot is not special in this day and age. Like he doesn't really bring anything to the front that is all that standoutish. You know, he has good survivability, but so do Ogryn and Arbites, and so does Veteran, and like, you know, Psyker is closing that gap significantly. So like every class is almost as tanky and unkillable as the Zealot is these days. So what does he have left to really identify him? It's certainly not his weapons, because almost all of those are shared between other classes. His Relic Blade and his Eviscerator are probably the best things he's got going for him there. And then in terms of abilities, it's like, okay, he's got like one, and this ability is pretty like milquetoast, and it doesn't really leverage a whole lot of power. So now, remember, like this game, you have to take it, when we're talking about the Zealot and how he's been benefited or hurt by this update, we have to take it in terms of a big picture. And when we look at the big picture and we see that at the same time that the Zealot was changed, there was also big buffs to the Psyker and also big buffs to the Veteran, well, those guys have eclipsed him, I feel like. I feel like they have eaten the Zealot's lunch, which is very funny because I was saying that other classes were eating the Veteran's lunch just like 2 or 3 months ago. And now I feel like the Zealot just does not really have a place. If I were making a Havoc 4-man squad, I don't think Chorus is good enough with the slow-ass cooldown that it has to justify bringing a Zealot anymore, and therefore I would probably just leave the Zealot home, because I don't think his DPS is good enough to bring him. I would bring some other class that can do DPS. I'd bring an Ogryn that can do DPS and stagger at the same time. I would bring the Arbites, who can give everybody the stagger buff and do DPS, or I would just bring a Flamestaff Psyker and like AoE the world. So yeah, this is the difficult situation that Zealot finds itself in. I think the one thing it has going for it now is it can insta-bonk and kill bosses. That's pretty fun for a little while, and it is very fast and can assassinate targets and stuff like that, but little by little, other classes draw ever closer to being able to do that stuff too. Like bosses are dying super fast these days between Ogryns and Arbites and Veterans, like focus targeting and staggering that shit and then throwing crack grenades at it. Boss killing really isn't a threat. You really don't need to devote like a Thunderhammer Zealot on the team to it. So yeah, that's where I'll leave it, guys. Not a failing grade for Zealot at all. What I would say is that overall, this update has definitely helped the Zealot. He is a better, more diverse class that has more options available to be powerful than he did before. The problem is that every other class has gotten a lot of power as well. In some senses, they have all leapfrogged him and are moving up in ways that he only could aspire to. And time remains to tell whether or not he's going to get any more significant updates to revolutionize him and make him have more options at his avail, but I can only hope for now. Anyway, guys, thank you very much for listening to this Yaptide. Make certain you're subscribed. If you listen to all this, you definitely are, you're definitely a real one. And I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.